In June 1998, the small town of Jasper, Texas, became the center of one of the most brutal hate crimes in American history. Cut to black and white photo of James Byrd Jr. smiling. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old father, musician, and lifelong resident, was just trying to make it home when he accepted a late-night ride from three white men. He didn't know it would be the last decision he'd ever make. Slow zoom on a lonely East Texas back road. Headlights flicker in the distance. What happened next would shock the nation. Byrd was beaten unconscious, chained to the back of a pickup truck, and dragged for nearly 3 miles along a rural road until his body was torn apart. Quick cuts, police tape, crime scene photos blurred, reporters speaking on 1998 TV screens. The murder was so savage, so senseless, that it reignited a national conversation about racism, justice, and the death penalty in America. But perhaps the most disturbing part, one of the men responsible, Russell Brewer, showed no remorse. Cut to mugshot of Brewer. Background audio fades into the clanging of prison gates. A self-proclaimed white supremacist with a violent criminal history, Brewer would eventually find himself on Texas death row, where his final meal became as infamous as his crime. He ordered a feast: steak, fried okra, triple bacon cheeseburgers, fajitas, a pound of barbecue, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge. But when the meal arrived, he refused to eat a single bite. That one act of arrogance made national headlines and led Texas to abolish last meal privileges for death row inmates forever. Cut to news clip: Texas in special last meals for inmates. It would take 13 years, countless appeals and legal battles, and one final walk to the death chamber before Brewer faced the consequences of his actions. And when asked for his last words, he simply said, "No." To understand how a racially motivated killing shook America to its core, and how a cold-blooded killer met his fate with one final act of defiance, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just haunt a town, it haunts a nation. Before the night that changed Jasper forever, Shawn Allen Berry was just another young man trying to find his place in a small East Texas town. Born in 1975, Berry had grown up in Jasper, a working-class environment marked by small-town rhythms and the struggles of blue-collar life. He wasn't known as an outspoken racist, nor was he deeply involved in extremist circles. In fact, people who knew him described him as quiet, somewhat directionless, and often trying to fit in with stronger personalities around him. Source: EBSCO, Encyclopedia Britannica, Wikipedia. Berry worked a variety of jobs, mostly manual labor. One of those jobs put him in close contact with John William King, a man who would soon become one of his closest friends and ultimately his greatest downfall. Their friendship began innocently enough, co-workers, drinking buddies, sharing the same circle. But their bond would take a dark turn once King introduced him to Russell Brewer, a man hardened by prison, consumed by hate, and steeped in white supremacist ideology. EBSCO Britannica. Berry had minor run-ins with the law before 1998. Small offenses, petty infractions, but nothing that hinted at the monstrous crime to come. Unlike King and Brewer, he didn't have a long criminal record or any affiliations with white power groups. Still, on the night of June 7, 1998, Berry was behind the wheel of his own Ford pickup truck, the very vehicle that would become a murder weapon. According to prosecutors, it was Berry who offered James Byrd Jr. a ride, making him the link between an unsuspecting victim and two men filled with hate. EBSCO, Britannica, Wikipedia. As the investigation unfolded, Berry's defense would argue that he wasn't driven by racial hatred, that he was, in many ways, a bystander swept up in the violence of his companions. His attorneys insisted that Berry didn't know what the others intended, that he panicked once the attack began, and that his role was passive rather than intentional. He wasn't a racist, they claimed. He was just in over his head. But the evidence told a different story, one of participation, of silence, and of complicity. Whether or not he shared the ideology, he shared in the crime. EBSCO. Transition. The sound of a pickup truck engine fades in, followed by the clinking of chains. The screen darkens as the narration shifts. If Shawn Berry was the follower, Lawrence Russell Brewer was the muscle, a man whose life had been shaped by violence, hatred, and time behind bars. Born in 1967 in Sulphur Springs, Texas, Brewer's early years were troubled from the start. By his late teens, he was already getting into fights, drinking heavily, and clashing with authority. What began as youthful rebellion quickly spiraled into a life of crime. The Texas Tribune Britannica. Brewer's criminal record grew over the years: burglary, theft, assault. But it was his time in prison that defined who he would become. While serving time, Brewer immersed himself in the world of white supremacist prison gangs. It was there that he found a perverse sense of belonging, surrounded by hate-filled ideology, tattoos, and propaganda that glorified racial violence. The Texas Tribune, Britannica, WCL.American.LibGuides.com. On his body, Brewer bore the marks of his allegiance: racist tattoos, Nazi symbols, and insignias associated with the Ku Klux Klan and Aryan Brotherhood. Investigators would later find connections between Brewer's prison writings and white supremacist literature, like the Turner Diaries, a book that had inspired extremists for decades. Britannica. By the time Brewer met John King in prison, the two men had become bonded through hate, sharing a belief in racial superiority and a readiness for violence. When they were both released, Brewer's criminal habits didn't stop. He was known to live recklessly, drifting between jobs, using drugs, and boasting about his hatred toward minorities. Britannica, WCL.American.LibGuides.com, Wikipedia. On the night of the crime, Brewer was not a passive participant. According to court testimony, he was one of the primary aggressors. He helped subdue Byrd, participated in the beating, and joined in chaining the victim to the truck. As the truck roared down Huff Creek Road, Brewer reportedly laughed, showing no hesitation or mercy. Later, when questioned by police, Brewer showed no remorse, describing the events with chilling detachment. WCL.American.LibGuides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. Even years later, on death row, Brewer remained defiant. In interviews, he denied feeling regret. As far as any remorse, he once said, "The only thing I'm sorry for is getting caught." Those words echoed through courtrooms, TV broadcasts, and into the hearts of every person who heard them, a chilling reminder of how deeply hate can consume a man. At the center of it all was John William King, the youngest of the three, yet the ideological ringleader. Born in 1975 in Jasper, Texas, King had grown up in the same small town where James Byrd Jr. lived his entire life. But while Byrd sang in the church choir and smiled at neighbors, King grew increasingly bitter and angry. Wikipedia, Britannica, WCL.American.LibGuides.com. As a teenager, King struggled to find direction. He dropped out of high school, bounced between odd jobs, and eventually wound up in prison for a string of robberies. It was there, behind bars, that his transformation took root. Surrounded by racial divisions in the Texas prison system, King gravitated toward white supremacist gangs for protection and identity. In prison, he met Lawrence Brewer, the older inmate who would feed his growing hatred. Wikipedia, Britannica, WCL.American.LibGuides.com. King immersed himself in white supremacist propaganda, covering his body in racist tattoos, a lynched black man hanging from a tree, lightning bolts, and the words Aryan pride. He began seeing himself as a soldier in a racial war, someone destined to make a statement through violence. Former associates later told investigators that King had a talent for persuasion, recruiting others into his twisted ideology, blending manipulation with a cold, charismatic edge. WCL.American.LibGuides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. After his release, King returned to Jasper, but he didn't come back to rebuild. He came back to prove something, to show the world he wasn't afraid to act on his hate. When he reconnected with Berry and Brewer, the trio became inseparable, spending nights drinking, talking, and sharing racist jokes. For King, the crime that would follow wasn't random. It was deliberate, ideological, and symbolic. WCL.American.libguides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. During his trial, prosecutors painted King as the mastermind, the one who chained Byrd to the truck and gave the order to drive. The defense, however, told another story. They claimed King wasn't even there during the dragging, that he'd been dropped off before the killing began. King himself maintained this version for years, denying he was the ringleader and insisting he'd been scapegoated because of his tattoos and beliefs. The Guardian, the Texas Tribune. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence, the chain, the truck, the DNA, the witness testimony, all pointed to his involvement from beginning to end. Prosecutors described him as a cold-blooded racist, a man whose hate turned to murder. King saw himself as something else, a symbol of defiance against the system he despised. That contrast between how he saw himself and what he really was would define his final years on death row. Transition. The sound of chains drags again, growing louder. The camera pans over the dark outline of Huff Creek Road. The night deepens. 3 men, 1 follower, 1 fighter, 1 leader. Different lives, same darkness. And together, their paths would converge in the early morning hours of June 7th, 1998, on a lonely stretch of asphalt in Jasper, Texas, where hate met its victim. It was the night of June 6th, 1998, and the small East Texas town of Jasper was settling down after another humid summer day. For James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old father of 3 and lifelong Jasper resident, it was a night like any other. Earlier that evening, Byrd had attended a small gathering at a friend's house, a relaxed get-together filled with laughter, music, and conversation. Known around town for his friendly personality and his ever-present smile, Byrd was the kind of man who never met a stranger. He enjoyed being around people, especially in his close-knit community on the east side of Jasper, known locally as the Quarters. Sources: WCL.American.libguides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. As the evening wound down, Byrd decided to walk home. He didn't own a car and was used to walking everywhere. The streets of Jasper were familiar to him. But that night, around 2:30 a.m., he made a fateful decision that would change the course of American history. On his walk home along Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, a pickup truck approached. A 1982 Ford driven by Shawn Allen Berry, with Lawrence Russell Brewer and John William King riding along. The 3 men had spent most of the evening drinking, driving around Jasper, and reportedly looking for women, their laughter echoing in the darkness as the truck's tires rolled over the gravel roads. Wikipedia, Britannica, the Texas Tribune. When they spotted Byrd walking alone, the group slowed down. Byrd, familiar with many faces in Jasper, likely didn't feel threatened. Berry was someone he recognized from around town. When they offered him a ride, he accepted, climbing into the bed of the truck, unaware that he had just stepped into a trap. WCL.American.libguides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. Moments later, that quiet country road became the starting point of one of the most brutal crimes in modern American history. Somewhere along a remote, wooded stretch of road off Huff Creek Road, the truck came to a stop. The men lured Byrd out of the vehicle under the pretense of continuing the ride, but instead, they attacked him without warning. The clearing they stopped him would later tell its own story. Broken bottles, drag marks, and disturbed soil all spoke of a violent struggle. Investigators later found evidence of a scuffle, confirming that Byrd had fought desperately to survive. Britannica, the Texas Tribune. Brewer and King were the primary aggressors. They beat Byrd savagely, kicking and punching him until he was unconscious. Witnesses later testified that racial slurs echoed through the woods that night. The attackers stripped Byrd of his clothes, leaving him only in his undershirt, and tied him up with logging chains they had retrieved from the back of the truck. The Texas Tribune, Britannica, Wikipedia. Then came the cruelest decision of all. They chained his ankles to the back of the truck. The crime scene evidence, beer bottles, cigarette butts, and a cigarette lighter engraved with the name Berry, painted a picture of hate and arrogance. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was deliberate, coordinated, and rooted in pure racism. In the aftermath, investigators would find KKK flyers, racist paraphernalia, and white supremacist writings linked to the men, proof that the killing was meant to send a message of terror. WCL.American.libguides.com, Britannica, Wikipedia. Transition. The sound of a chain tightening fades into a dragging noise. A faint echo of metal scraping asphalt builds slowly into a roar. What happened next would scar not just Jasper, but the conscience of an entire nation. The truck pulled forward, its tires gripping the rough pavement of Huff Creek Road. James Byrd Jr., still alive, was dragged behind it. The distance was nearly 3 miles, or about 5 kilometers, along the winding, isolated stretch of country road. The Texas Tribune, Wikipedia, Britannica. For much of that horrifying journey, Byrd remained conscious. Forensic experts later confirmed that his body bore deep abrasions consistent with someone being dragged while alive. As the truck accelerated, Byrd's body hit a concrete culvert. The impact severed his head, right arm, and shoulder, ending his suffering in an instant. Britannica, Wikipedia, WCL.American.libguides.com. The men didn't stop. They kept driving, dragging the remainder of Byrd's body another 1.5 miles before dumping what was left in front of an African-American cemetery, the Hollywood Cemetery. To them, it was symbolic, a final act of racial hatred, leaving his mutilated remains in a place meant to honor Black lives. The Texas Tribune, Wikipedia, WCL.American.libguides.com. Afterward, the 3 men returned to Berry's apartment, laughing and washing the blood off the truck. The following morning, they went about their day as if nothing had happened. Brewer later told acquaintances that in ********** ain't gonna live no more, showing zero remorse. At dawn on June 7, 1998, a passing motorist made a chilling discovery. Along Huff Creek Road, Byrd's remains were scattered, his torso lying in the road, his head and arm several yards away. At first, police believed it was a hit and run, but it didn't take long for them to realize something far more sinister had happened. The gruesome scene stretched for miles, blood trails, drag marks, and pieces of Byrd's body clothing the asphalt. EBSCO Britannica. Investigators worked through the morning, collecting evidence and documenting what would become one of the most important crime scenes in Texas history. Locals who arrived at the site were horrified. One witness said, "You could see every mark, every place he had been dragged. It looked like the road itself had been torn open." The horror of it shocked Jasper, a town where white and black residents had lived side by side for decades. Transition. Police radios crackle, flashlights sweep across the scene. Evidence markers appear one by one. From the start, the Jasper County Sheriff's Office knew they were dealing with something more than murder. This was a hate crime. Crime scene investigators meticulously followed the trail. Tire tracks from a Ford pickup, a wrench with Berry's name engraved on it, and a lighter found near the clearing. Each piece brought them closer to the killers. The Texas Tribune, Inside Edition, Britannica. Within 24 hours, investigators had identified the truck, a gray 1982 Ford owned by Shawn Allen Berry. When they found it, there was blood on the bumper, human hair on the undercarriage, and a chain missing from the toolbox. Berry was arrested first, and after hours of interrogation, he began to talk. His statements led police to Lawrence Brewer and John King, both of whom had prior criminal records and documented white supremacist ties. The Texas Tribune, Inside Edition, Britannica. By June 8th, the FBI had been called in to assist. The crime had captured national attention almost instantly. Agents worked with local and state authorities to piece together the evidence, collect DNA samples, and trace the movement of the suspects. Inside Edition. Within days, the 3 men were formally charged with capital murder. Jasper, Texas, a town barely known outside its county line, had suddenly become a symbol of America's struggle with race, hate, and justice. In less than a day, 3 men had turned a simple act of kindness, accepting a ride home, into a hate-fueled execution. But the road to justice was only beginning, and in the years that followed, The world would learn every haunting detail of the crime, through trials, testimonies, and one unforgettable meal before death. In the months following the murder of James Byrd Jr., the small town of Jasper became the epicenter of a national reckoning. The crime had been so brutal, so racially motivated, that Texas prosecutors moved swiftly, determined to seek the harshest penalty available under law: capital murder in the course of kidnapping. Under Texas Penal Code Section 19.03, this charge carried one of two possible outcomes: life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. Sources: txcourts.gov, Encyclopedia Britannica. The first to stand trial was John William King, in February 1999, inside a courthouse packed with media, activists, and citizens still reeling from the horror that had unfolded less than a year earlier. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They would not just prove King's guilt, but expose the ideological hatred that fueled the murder. In their opening statements, prosecutors presented DNA evidence, blood-stained tools, chain fragments, and tire tracks from Berry's Ford truck that matched the marks left on Huff Creek Road. They also introduced forensic testimony showing that Byrd was alive through much of the dragging, proof of deliberate torture. Wikipedia, txcourts.gov, Britannica. But it wasn't just physical evidence that sealed King's fate. It was his own writings and tattoos, along with witness testimony, that painted him as a committed white supremacist. The jury saw photographs of his tattoos: a lynched black man, lightning bolts, and the words Aryan Pride. They were also shown excerpts from letters King had written while in jail, expressing no remorse and suggesting he believed his actions would inspire others. txcourts.gov, Britannica. The defense, meanwhile, struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. King's attorneys argued that he had been dropped off before the murder occurred, suggesting that Brewer and Berry acted alone. They questioned the reliability of accomplice testimony and claimed the prosecution's narrative was exaggerated by public outrage and political pressure. They even challenged the fairness of King's legal representation, hinting that the case had been decided in the court of public opinion long before the jury sat down. The Texas Tribune, Britannica. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of capital murder. King was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming the first white man in modern Texas history to receive the death penalty for killing a black man. WCL.American.libguides.com, Wikipedia, Britannica. Later that same year, in September 1999, Lawrence Russell Brewer stood trial on nearly identical charges. The evidence against him was equally damning. His fingerprints were found on the chain, his shoe prints at the crime scene, and his own confession to fellow inmates revealed chilling details of the killing. Prosecutors described Brewer as a man driven by pure racial hatred, showing the jury photos of his racist tattoos and recounting his prison ties to white supremacist groups. Brewer showed little emotion throughout the proceedings, smirking occasionally, whispering to his attorneys, and even laughing at times. His defense team tried to argue that Brewer was intoxicated that night, that he hadn't intended to kill Byrd, and that he was influenced by King's ideology. But the jury saw through the excuses. Brewer was found guilty of capital murder and, like King, was sentenced to death. WCL.American.libguides.com, Wikipedia, Britannica. Shawn Allen Berry, who had cooperated with authorities and whose level of participation was debated, faced trial separately in 2000. His defense convinced the jury that while he played a role, he was less culpable and did not share the same racial motivation. Berry was convicted of capital murder but received life imprisonment, sparing him the death penalty. WCL.American.libguides.com, Wikipedia, Britannica. Transition. Courtroom doors close. The camera lingers on Byrd's family, silent, tearful, holding one another. Then fades to the ticking of a clock, symbolizing time passing, appeals mounting. With the verdicts delivered, the legal battle was far from over. Both King and Brewer launched a series of appeals, a process that would drag on for more than a decade. Their lawyers challenged everything from jury selection and legal representation to procedural issues and claims of innocence. Wikipedia, the Texas Tribune Britannica. King's attorneys argued that the prosecution unfairly used his tattoos and racist writings to bias the jury, claiming these expressions were protected under the First Amendment and did not directly prove his involvement in Byrd's death. Others alleged that his trial lawyers failed to properly assert his innocence before the jury, a key claim in his final appeal. The Texas Tribune. Despite multiple appeals reaching both the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, all efforts failed. The courts repeatedly upheld the convictions, stating that the evidence was overwhelming and that the brutality of the crime left no room for reasonable doubt. Wikipedia Britannica. As the years went by, public attention turned to the ethics of capital punishment. Activists debated whether executing the killers was justice or vengeance, while Byrd's family, particularly his son, Ross Byrd, publicly forgave the men, saying, "We've already done enough. Let's stop the cycle of hate." Yet others insisted that the executions were necessary, a message that such hate-driven crimes would not be tolerated in Texas or anywhere in America. The Texas Tribune Britannica. Transition. Prison corridor visuals. The echo of footsteps. Fade into a close-up of the Huntsville unit's death chamber clock reading 6 p.m. 13 years after the murder, on September 21, 2011, Lawrence Russell Brewer was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Before his death, Brewer became infamous for one final act of arrogance, his last meal request. He ordered a feast so excessive it made national headlines. 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, fried okra, a pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, a pizza, a pint of ice cream, and peanut butter fudge. When the meal was brought to him, Brewer refused to eat a single bite. The stunt outraged state officials, prompting Texas to abolish the tradition of special last meals for death row inmates. Kutztown University, Wikipedia, wcl.american.libguides.com. When asked for his final words, Brewer smirked and said only one thing. No, a single syllable, cold, defiant, unrepentant. At 6:21 p.m., he was pronounced dead. 8 years later, on April 24, 2019, John William King followed him into the same death chamber. Now 44 years old, King had spent 2 decades maintaining his innocence, still claiming he'd been dropped off before the killing began. But the courts, the evidence, and the public had long since moved past his denials. As the curtain opened, he faced witnesses, including members of Byrd's family. Unlike Brewer, King gave no final statement. The lethal injection began at 6:56 p.m., and by 7:08, he was pronounced dead. Britannica, the Texas Tribune, Wikipedia. The last of the trio, Shawn Allen Berry, remains alive, serving a life sentence at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Ramsey Unit. He will be eligible for parole in 2038, though few believe he will ever walk free. Wikipedia. Transition. Footage of the Huntsville unit fades into archival news clips of Jasper, Texas, church bells ringing, murals painted in Byrd's honor, community vigils lit by candlelight. The trials were over. The appeals were done. 2 men died by the same system they had once mocked, and 1 remains behind bars. But the impact of their crime, and the courage of James Byrd Jr.'s family, would echo across the nation, changing laws, inspiring movements, and reshaping America's understanding of hate itself. Over 2 decades later, the name James Byrd Jr. still echoes through the heart of America, a reminder of the pain racism can cause and the power of justice to stand against it. Lawrence Brewer met his end with defiance. John King followed years later, still claiming innocence. But for the Byrd family, no sentence could truly erase the horror of that night on Huff Creek Road. Visuals fade to black and white photo of James Byrd Jr. smiling with family, then transition to color with the Crime Report Network logo. What do you think? Did justice truly prevail in this case? Or does hate always leave a scar too deep for time to heal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and comment your views. And make sure to subscribe to Crime Report Network for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest sides of humanity and the pursuit of justice. Visuals, channel logo animation, closing tagline appears. Crime Report Network, where justice speaks. Fade out with sound of wind through trees.